Epilogue. The Karma Connection. In the quiet of Miles's townhouse apartment in central London, the faint hum of the television filled the air. The news anchor's grave tone cut through the stillness. The television droned on, a grim montage of the world's turmoil. Another terrorist attack has left dozens dead and hundreds injured in the Middle East. Experts warn this could escalate into a larger regional conflict. The screen shifted to a stern-faced anchor. Breaking news. While global warming continues to plunge the planet into crisis, politicians persist in dismissing climate change as a hoax. Meanwhile, Tescron, a leading energy corporation, has reported record-breaking profits this year, a reflection of rising global energy demands, sparking renewed debate among environmental groups. In related news, a high-profile CEO has been arrested for swindling billions of dollars in public funds, leaving thousands of families without homes or pensions. The next report showed angry crowds, fists raised in defiance. Protests continue in Africa as corruption scandals rock the government, with millions in aid money siphoned into offshore accounts while communities suffer. Finally, the broadcast cut to breaking headlines. Tensions escalate as Russia and Poland edge closer to war, with military movements along the border sparking fears of a full-scale conflict. Experts warn this could displace millions and plunge the region into chaos. The unrelenting stream of despair painted a picture of a world unraveling at its seams. The world seemed consumed by chaos, greed, and destruction. Miles stood by the window, a faint light filtering in through the sheer curtains. He was dressed in dark jeans, a slightly wrinkled white shirt with the top buttons undone, and a corduroy jacket with suspenders. His round glasses perched on his nose, and in his hand, he held the small crystal pendant Helena had given him in Atlantis. The pendant glowed faintly as he held it, shifting between soft gradients of red, green, and blue. The colors moved like whispers of light, subtle but alive, casting a faint glow against his fingertips. Miles stared at it, his expression a mix of longing and sorrow. Without a word, he lifted the pendant to his lips and kissed it gently, closing his eyes as if the simple act could bridge the distance between them. The gesture held all the words he couldn't say, carrying the weight of his emotions in silence. The pendant's light dimmed as he lowered his hand, its glow disappearing entirely. Miles sighed deeply, slipping the pendant back around his neck and tucking it beneath his shirt. He buttoned up his shirt carefully, straightened his tie, and adjusted it with practiced precision. On the stand nearby, his fedora waited. He picked it up, smoothing the brim before placing it on his head. Fully dressed, he looked every bit the scholar, a man weighed down not only by knowledge but by the memories of a life and a love he could never truly leave behind. Miles glanced at the faint reflection in the window, adjusting his glasses. Then, with a quiet resolve, he turned toward the door, ready to face the fractured world waiting for him beyond it. Miles left home, the London skyline still wrapped in the hush of early morning. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of a city waking up, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, still lost in the depths of the ocean, in a city that no longer existed, in a memory that refused to fade. Back at the British Museum, he moved through the familiar halls, past towering statues and ancient relics that had stood the test of time. But nothing in this place, nothing in all the carefully curated history surrounding him could compare to what he had seen, to what he had lost. Miles stood at the front of the packed auditorium in the British Museum, his voice commanding yet calm as he gestured toward the glowing projection behind him. Images of glyphs, ruins, and Atlantis artifacts illuminated the room, holding the audience in rapt attention. He gestured to the faintly carved stone on the projection behind him, its intricate glyphs glowing softly. "Plato," he began, his voice tinged with intensity, "would have you believe that Atlantis was a corrupt civilization, greedy, arrogant, consumed by power. He claimed their arrogance angered the gods who sank their city in divine punishment. But let me tell you this, Plato was wrong." The room grew quiet as Miles's words took on a sharper edge. The Atlanteans were not the power-hungry tyrants that history has painted them to be. They were, in fact, the most virtuous people, a society that valued harmony, respected the environment, and sought to uplift those around them. They hated war, despised greed, and dedicated themselves to helping other civilizations flourish. He turned back to the glowing glyphs, his hand brushing the edges of the image. Their language alone tells us everything about their values. These symbols don't just represent words, they embody ideas, virtues, and their moral compass. They believed in knowledge, unity, and balance, things Plato conveniently ignored in his narrative of Atlantis as a cautionary tale. Miles paused, his eyes scanning the audience. The Atlanteans were stewards of their world, building their society around respecting nature's power, not exploiting it. Their downfall wasn't some divine retribution for arrogance. It was a tragedy, a civilization of brilliance and morality lost to forces beyond their control. Plato reduced them to villains, but the evidence speaks otherwise. He took a step back, letting his words sink in. So, the next time someone quotes Plato's account of Atlantis as a warning of human corruption, remember this: sometimes history is rewritten to fit a narrative. And in this case, it's a narrative that doesn't do justice to the truth of the Atlanteans and what they stood for. The audience murmured with interest, many scribbling notes or snapping photos. Miles adjusted his stance as he always did when finishing a lecture, scanning the crowd for engagement. And then, as the applause swelled and the crowd began to disperse, a woman approached, her steps purposeful yet unhurried. She stood out, not because of her striking features, though she was undeniably beautiful, but because of something subtler, a quiet intensity in her gaze. Miles felt his breath catch for reasons he couldn't explain. Her presence was familiar? "Professor Shaw," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, with a tone that carried an air of quiet confidence. "Your discussion of Atlantean language reminded me of something I've always believed. The heart of a civilization is not its cities, but its stories." Miles froze, those exact words. His heart skipped, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the shock. It was impossible. Those were Helena's words, spoken to him in the ruins of Atlantis, words burned into his memory forever. He stared at her, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but nothing came out. She shifted slightly, self-conscious under his gaze. Seeing his reaction, she smiled a little awkwardly. "Sorry, did I say something strange?" Miles cleared his throat, shaking himself out of it. "No, not at all," he said quickly. "It's just, that's an unusual thought. Where did you hear it?" She tilted her head, thinking for a moment. "I'm not sure. It's something that's been with me for a long time, almost like I've always known it." Miles gave her a faint smile, still unsettled. "Well, it's an interesting perspective. What brings you here today? Are you a student of ancient civilizations?" She shook her head. "No, but I've always been drawn to them, especially Atlantis. Something about it feels familiar, like I've been chasing it my whole life." Miles's eyes drifted lower, drawn to the delicate tattoos curling along her forearms, swirling, elegant patterns, identical to the ones Helena wore in Atlantis. His breath caught again, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. "Those tattoos," he murmured without thinking. She glanced at her arms and smiled faintly. "Oh, these? I've always had them. I don't even know where the designs came from. They've just always been a part of me." Miles blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. Everything about her, the words, the tattoos, the way she stood, was too familiar. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't. She held out a hand, her smile warm and genuine. "I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. My name is Helena." The world seemed to stop. He felt like he was standing in the ruins of Atlantis again, her calm presence and the name that carried the weight of another life. "Helena," he repeated softly, almost as if testing the word, feeling its gravity. She extended her hand, her smile steady, her eyes holding a warmth that felt both familiar and unexplainable. "It's such a pleasure to meet you, Professor Shaw," she said, her voice calm, as though this moment was always meant to happen. Miles took her hand, his grip firm yet hesitant, his heart racing as though the world had stopped moving around them. "The pleasure is mine, Helena," he replied, his voice quieter now, thoughtful. As their hands parted, she tilted her head slightly, her brows furrowing as if something was tugging at her memory. "This might sound strange," she said, her voice soft. "But have we met before? You look so familiar." Miles hesitated for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. Then he smiled faintly, a mix of awe and certainty in his expression. "We have," he said simply, his voice tinged with something deeper. "They say karma works in mysterious ways. Perhaps this was always meant to happen, no matter how far apart our worlds were." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, as if the universe itself had tied their paths together. Breaking the moment with a warm smile, Miles gestured toward the corridor. "Would you care to join me for a cup of tea in the museum cafe? I promise it's decent for museum standards. And besides," he added with a soft chuckle, "it's a very British way to handle intriguing meetings like this." Helena met his gaze, a soft smile forming as she said, "I like that. Tea sounds perfect." The end.